Daniel Carter had spent most of his 65 years quietly, far from the noise of war but never quite escaping its memories. A war veteran, he carried the scars of battle both on his body and in his mind. Years of service had left him with chronic pain from old injuries, aches that no amount of time could ease. Today he found himself sitting in the waiting room of the local VA hospital, his face etched with weariness. The sterile walls, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the distant murmurs of other veterans filled the air. The hospital was cold, the atmosphere thick with unspoken frustration and exhaustion. Once Daniel had been proud to serve his country, but now, as he looked around at the tired faces of his fellow soldiers, a bitter realization gnawed at him. The system that had once honored them now seemed to view them as burdens. As Daniel sat in the crowded waiting room, he couldn't help but notice the quiet tension in the air. The staff moved quickly, their footsteps sharp against the cold tile floor, but something felt off. His attention was drawn to a group of hospital employees gathered near the corner, their hushed voices blending into the background noise. He watched as they exchanged furtive glances at an elderly man in a wheelchair. The veteran's face was weathered, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to steady himself. Daniel recognized him immediately. Frank Dawson, a fellow soldier from his unit. The memories of their time in service flashed through Daniel's mind, but what caught his attention was the odd behavior of the staff. A young nurse stood near Frank, her brow furrowed in concern, but her voice was barely audible as she argued with an older doctor. The words, "just let it go, and they won't approve his treatment," slipped through the cracks of their conversation, making Daniel's heart race. He leaned forward slightly, straining to catch more of their exchange. The doctor's tone was cold, dismissive, almost like they were talking about a lost cause. "It's just a waste of time, Frank doesn't have much longer anyway," the doctor muttered under his breath, and Daniel's blood ran cold. He stared at Frank, wondering if he had any idea what was happening just a few feet away. Something wasn't right. Daniel leaned back in his chair, pretending to read the worn magazine in his hands, but his attention remained fixed on the exchange between the nurse and the doctor. He knew something wasn't right. His old instincts kicked in, and he strained to hear their quiet conversation. The nurse, her voice tight with frustration, insisted, "Frank deserves proper care, you can't just ignore him." The doctor, however, was unmoved. His words were clipped and dismissive, clearly uninterested in the pleas of the young nurse. "The hospital's budget cuts mean we have to prioritize," he said, his eyes never leaving the paperwork in front of him. "Older veterans like Frank don't make the cut anymore." Daniel's heart sank as he listened, the anger rising like a fire in his chest. Why waste resources on a dying man? The doctor's words echoed in his ears, and he couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was Frank, his comrade, his brother in arms. To hear him reduced to a mere statistic, just another casualty of a failing system, made Daniel's blood boil. As the conversation continued, another staff member joined in, speaking with a quiet, resigned tone. "Some critical treatments are deliberately delayed for elderly veterans. We don't have the resources to treat them all, and it's easier to let them fade away." Daniel's fists clenched so tightly, his knuckles turned white. He wanted to shout, to storm over and demand answers. This wasn't just about Frank, this was about every veteran who had ever been treated like this. Every person who had sacrificed so much, only to be discarded when they needed care the most. His mind raced. This couldn't go on. The rage that bubbled inside him was more than just anger, it was the deep, burning need for justice. It was time for someone to speak up. As Daniel sat there, pretending to focus on the conversation unfolding before him, his mind was pulled back to another time, another place. The sterile walls of the hospital faded, replaced by the dusty, smoke-filled air of a battlefield from years ago. The noise of the waiting room was drowned out by the deafening sounds of gunfire, the heavy thuds of mortar shells exploding in the distance. He could see his comrades clearly, young men, full of hope and dreams, suddenly stripped away in the blink of an eye. The blood, the sweat, the endless days of fighting for survival. But it wasn't just the violence that haunted him, it was the faces of those who had fallen, the ones who didn't make it back home. He had seen too many good men die, their lives snuffed out before they ever had the chance to fulfill their potential. One face stood out among the others, Marcus, a soldier who had become like a brother to him. They had made a pact before leaving for the front lines. No matter what, they would always have each other's backs. But Marcus had fallen, caught in a firefight, his life lost before Daniel could get to him. Daniel had always carried the guilt of not being able to save him. That promise he made to always protect his brothers in arms haunted him every day. As the doctor's words echoed in his ears, a painful realization began to form in Daniel's mind. Had some of his friends died because they weren't given the care they needed? He thought about the injuries that had lingered after the war, so many of them, both physical and mental. Had they suffered not just from the horrors of battle, but from neglect? The idea twisted his stomach. The country they had fought so hard to protect had turned its back on them. Once they were celebrated heroes, their names etched in monuments, their sacrifices revered. Now it seemed, they were treated as if they were nothing more than burdens, too old, too broken, too inconvenient. The promises made to them during the war, the honor they were promised in return for their service, felt like empty words now. His anger flared again, but this time it was deeper, more personal. The betrayal stung, and the weight of it felt suffocating. He realized with a jolt that it wasn't just Frank or Marcus, it was every single veteran. They were all being forgotten, abandoned by the very country they had given everything for, and Daniel knew one thing for sure: it was time to fight back. The anger that had been simmering inside Daniel finally boiled over. He couldn't stay silent anymore. Frank, his comrade, was being treated like a burden. He had heard the doctors dismiss him, heard the words that sealed the fates of so many others, and it was clear to him now that this wasn't an isolated case. It was happening to veterans across the country. The injustice, the cruelty, the neglect, he couldn't let it go. With his heart pounding in his chest, Daniel stood up from his seat. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but something had to be done. He marched over to the group of hospital staff still gathered near Frank's wheelchair. The young nurse was standing off to the side, her face drawn with exhaustion. "What is going on here?" Daniel's voice was firm, cutting through the tension in the air. The doctor glanced up from his paperwork, annoyance flashing across his face. "Excuse me, sir, you need to calm down," the doctor said, his tone cold. "No, I won't calm down." Daniel shot back, his voice rising. "You're letting men like Frank die because you don't care. This isn't about budget cuts or policies, this is about human lives." The doctor's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I suggest you sit down, sir, or I'll have to ask security to remove you." But before the doctor could say anything further, the nurse, her eyes filled with fear, took a small step forward. She hesitated for a moment, then discreetly handed Daniel a set of documents. The papers were stamped with the hospital's seal, and as Daniel quickly scanned them, he felt his blood run cold. They contained records of delayed treatments, denied surgeries, and most damning of all, hospital policies designed to withhold care from elderly veterans. The evidence was undeniable. Before Daniel could react, security was already heading toward him, the tension in the room rising as the staff tried to quell the situation. But as Daniel raised his voice once more, demanding that the truth be heard, something unexpected happened. A few other veterans in the waiting room, who had been watching quietly, stood up, their faces set with determination. "He's right," one of them said, his voice gruff but strong. "We've been waiting for too long." Others nodded in agreement, their collective support growing stronger. The hospital staff, seeing the situation spiral out of control, began to panic. Hospital administration appeared from a back office, trying to usher Daniel and the others into a more private space, but it was too late. The damage was done. Daniel wasn't going to back down. The truth was out, and there was no way to hide it anymore. This wasn't just about Frank anymore, it was about every veteran who had been ignored, abandoned, and forgotten. The fight had only just begun. As security moved toward Daniel, ready to escort him out, he stood his ground. His mind raced, wondering if all this would be for nothing. The hospital staff was doing everything they could to silence him, to cover up the truth. His heart was pounding, but he refused to back down. That was when a voice cut through the growing tension. "Wait." Everyone turned, and Daniel's eyes locked onto a woman standing near the entrance. She was holding a notepad and a recorder, her presence almost unnoticed until now. She stepped forward confidently, her eyes focused on Daniel. "I'm sorry, but I couldn't help overhearing." The woman introduced herself as Jessica Clark, a reporter with a local news station. "I've been investigating claims like this for weeks. This is exactly what I've been looking for." The room fell silent as everyone processed her words. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. A reporter. This could be the breakthrough they needed. "You've been looking into this?" Daniel asked, his voice still thick with anger. "Yes," she replied, nodding. "I've received multiple reports of veterans being denied proper care, delayed treatments, inadequate resources. And now you've just confirmed everything I've been researching." Jessica turned to the nurse, who was standing nearby, her eyes wide with surprise. "Would you be willing to share your story?" she asked. "This could expose everything, the truth about what's really happening here." The nurse hesitated for a moment, but the support from Daniel and the other veterans gave her strength. She took a deep breath and nodded. Without another word, she handed Jessica a thick stack of documents, more proof of the unethical practices happening behind the hospital's walls. The hospital director, now fully aware of the danger, stepped forward, panic flashing across his face. "This is a private matter, and I can assure you," but it was too late. Jessica's camera was already rolling, the recorder capturing every word. The truth was out, and there was no turning back now. The scandal had begun, and the fight for justice had just been given the fuel it needed. Within days, the story exploded across the nation. The shocking revelations about the mistreatment of veterans were all over the news. Social media was flooded with posts, hashtags demanding justice, and calls for accountability. The video of the confrontation at the hospital, along with the documents the nurse had provided, spread like wildfire, sparking nationwide outrage. People were appalled to learn how the very heroes who had fought for their country were being left to suffer in silence. Protests erupted outside VA hospitals across the country, with veterans and their families demanding action. Investigations into hospital corruption began, and the government launched an inquiry into the systemic neglect faced by elderly veterans. The public's anger grew by the day as the truth became undeniable. Daniel and Frank, once soldiers on the battlefield, had become warriors for justice in a very different fight. Frank received the treatment he had been denied for so long, finally getting the care he deserved. But even as the hospital system faced the consequences of its actions, Daniel knew not all veterans would be as fortunate. Too many had suffered and died in silence, their stories untold. The battle was far from over, the hospital was under intense scrutiny, but Daniel understood that the road to true justice would be long. He couldn't stop now, there were still countless veterans waiting for their voices to be heard. Daniel vowed to continue the fight, not just for Frank, but for every veteran who had been forgotten. They had sacrificed everything for the country, now it was time for the country to do the same for them. The war for their dignity had just begun. Daniel stood outside the hospital, his gaze fixed on the American flag fluttering in the wind. He thought of the men he had fought beside those who had made the ultimate sacrifice, and wondered what their sacrifices truly meant now. The country had forgotten them, but he wouldn't forget. Though his body was wounded and aging, his spirit remained unbroken. He whispered a quiet promise to his fallen brothers: "I won't let them forget us." The road ahead would be long, and the battle far from over, but Daniel felt a flicker of hope. The fight for justice had only just begun. Thank you for watching this powerful and emotional story of courage, betrayal, and the fight for justice. Daniel's journey is a reminder that heroes deserve to be honored, not forgotten. His determination to stand up for his brothers in arms shows us the strength of the human spirit and the importance of never giving up, even in the face of overwhelming odds. If you found this story moving, please don't forget to like, comment, and share it with others. Let's spread the word about the struggles veterans face and honor their sacrifices. Subscribe for more stories that highlight the voices of those who need to be heard. Thank you for being part of this journey, and together, we can keep their stories alive.